Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, well, it looks like I'm seeing the numbers kind of steady. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the proposed draft guidance and regulations for the cumulative impact analysis. My name is Jonathan Harstick with ERG. I'm a contractor supporting this effort. Oh, was that? Okay. Before we get started, I have some interpretation instructions to go over. This webinar is available with virtual interpretation into Portuguese, Spanish, Mandarin, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean Creole, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Arabic, Russian, Kumar, Korean, and French. In a few moments, I'm going to turn on interpretation, or I'm going to turn it over to Dan to go over interpretation. You'll be able to see a Zoom control panel, a globe icon on your Zoom control panel. Once that pops up, you can click on it and select your desired language. English speakers should select English to hear any translated comments. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dan to introduce all of our interpreters.
Thank you. The language announcement will now begin. For English, please click on the interpretation icon and select English. For Portuguese, please.
Para acessar as traduções nessa sessão, clique no globo terrestre no canto inferior da tela e selecione o idioma português. Interpretation completed.
For Spanish.
Si alguien desea interpretación en español, haga clic en Interpretation y seleccione Spanish.
For Haitian Creole, please.
Pour monde qui parle créole, si vous avez besoin d'entrer dans la partie qui est interprétation créole là, vous allez sur le globe là, sur l'icône qui écrit interprétation, et puis cliquez sur créole haïtien, et puis vous apte de toute conversation créole. Merci.
For Cape Verdean Creole, please.
Para participar na crioulo, clica na Interpretation e escolhe Cape Verdean Creole.
For Vietnamese, please.
Để vào kênh tiếng Việt, vui lòng nhấp vào biểu tượng Interpretation quả địa cầu và chọn kênh Vietnamese. Xin cảm ơn.
For Arabic, please.
للمشاركة باللغة العربية اضغط على أيقونة الترجمة الفورية Interpretation ثم اختر Arabic.
For Russian, please.
Коли він мав тільки 4 рочки, в нього була підозра на астму, але вона не підтвердилася.
Hello.
І зараз наш педіатр суд в Штатах не підтвердив цього діагнозу.
Thank you. For Khmer, please.
ដើម្បីចូលរួមជាភាសាខ្មែរសូមចុចរូបតំណាងការបកប្រែហើយជ្រើសរើសភាសាខ្មែរ
For Korean, please.
한국어로 참여하려면 통역 아이콘을 클릭하고 코리안을 선택하세요.
For French, please.
Pour participer en français, cliquez sur l'icône Interprétation et choisissez French.
The language announcement is now completed. Thank you.
All right, I just turned on interpretation, so you all should be seeing that on your screen shortly. If you do not see it, you can click on the More icon indicated by 3 dots. Interpretation should be on the menu that pops up there. Closed captions is available by clicking on the CC icon in the Zoom control panel. If you have audio issues during the meeting, you can call in by clicking on the arrow next to the audio icon on your Zoom control panel. Select Switch to Phone Audio and follow the instructions provided. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, you can message me in the chat box or email meetings@erg.com, and I can troubleshoot your issues with you. Attendees can submit questions in the Q&A box. If you would like to make a comment during the public comment time, please raise your hand and I can promote you to a panelist where you can be seen and heard by audience members. If you are commenting in another language, please speak into your language channel and your interpreter will translate the comment into English. Or you may type a comment into the Q&A box and they will be read aloud. We're going to start with some opening presentations and then we will take public comment. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes each. A timer will be displayed on the screen as you talk. As you just heard, this event is being simultaneously interpreted into 11 languages. Please speak slowly and clearly to the interpreters to ensure that they can interpret your comments accurately. Please aim to stay within your 3-minute comment period, as we do have a lot of folks registered for today. Thank you in advance for understanding, and that we would like to give everyone who wishes to comment the opportunity to do so. That's everything for housekeeping. I'll now turn it over to Commissioner Rubin for opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and to ERG, and a big thank you to our interpreters for joining us today and allowing us to have a meeting that allows for language access for all. Thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, which is jointly hosted by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Office of Environmental Justice and Equity, as well as the Department of Public Utilities Siting Division, which staffs the Energy Facilities Siting Board. My name is Stacy Rubin, and I am a DPU commissioner and also a member of the Energy Facilities Siting Board, which I will refer to as the Siting Board. I acknowledge that my fellow Siting Board members will be here as their schedules allow. We're gathered today to discuss a topic that is near and dear to me, which is cumulative impacts analysis. The 2024 Climate Act that was enacted last November directs the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Office of Environmental Justice and Equity to develop guidelines for cumulative impacts analysis. The 2024 Climate Act also requires the Siting Board to promulgate regulations to integrate cumulative impact analysis into the Siting Board's process, which should be developed in accordance to the guidance by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Office of Environmental Justice and Equity's guidance. Today, we will provide an update on all of the work that we've been doing. The Siting Board typically holds open meetings with a formal agenda and a court stenographer. Today's webinar is a unique format for the Siting Board. We do not have a court stenographer. We are recording today's webinar and we will post the recording to the Siting Board's YouTube channel, and we will include links on the state's siting and permitting web pages. You'll also see we have a slide deck for today. We will post those slides on the Siting and Permitting website, and we will post translated versions of the slides in multiple languages shortly. The plan for today's webinar is for Undersecretary Maria Belen Power and Saina Mashmasarmi from the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity to present about a proposed tool called Mass EnviroScreen, which will be used in the siting and permitting process. After the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity presents, there will be a brief period where we will take questions specific to that presentation. While you are welcome to put questions in the chat, we will only call on people who raise their virtual hands in Zoom during that time. We will likely not get to all questions during that first brief question and answer section. Next, we will move to a presentation by Andy Green, Director of the Department of Public Utilities Siting Division, and Tim Riley, a Department of Public Utilities Siting Analyst. They will present about the proposed cumulative impacts analysis proposal. We will then have a brief period for initial questions for Director Green and Tim Riley. Again, we will prioritize questions for those who raise their virtual hands in Zoom. We will take a 15-minute break around 3:45. And at that time, we will come back at 4 o'clock. We will have time for comments. Everyone. I will note that we have more than 230 people registered for today's webinar. And we're really excited about the turnout, but because of the large number of people and anticipated topics, we will limit remarks to 3 minutes, as you heard from Jonathan. I'll note that the Department of Energy Resources held various information sessions and a public hearing about the small consolidated clean energy infrastructure proposal a few weeks ago. Yesterday evening, the Siting Board concluded our 4th public hearing on the broader set of regulations relating to the siting and permitting changes. So we request that your comments and questions today focused on cumulative impact analysis. Our team will do their best to respond to your questions and comments. For those of you who've been following our work closely, the Siting Board and staff have prepared draft materials over the last year, including straw proposals and draft regulations for discussion purposes first, before we released comments, before releasing regulations for the formal public comment process. This state team working on siting and permitting changes has really valued the exchange with the public on those earlier drafts and the straw proposals. We are continuing the process to offer an informal public comment period now focused on cumulative impacts analysis. We posted the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity's cumulative impact analysis guidance and the Siting Board's draft regulations, as well as a beta version of Mass EnviroScreen last Friday. We are accepting questions and comments on those materials today. We are also accepting written comments through November 17th. After November 17th, staff will work to improve the guidance and Siting Board regulations, which will be at 980 CMR 15. The next steps include the Siting Board meeting that will be in mid-December. Then there will be a vote to open the rulemaking focused on cumulative impacts analysis. Once the Siting Board meets and votes, the plan is to file the proposed regulations with the Secretary of State on December 19th, 2025. That commences the formal rulemaking process. We will then have public hearings on the cumulative impact analysis regulations, and we will accept written comments through February 13th of 2026. We're just trying to be clear on the next steps. We will then have 2 additional Siting Board meetings, one in February and one in April. The first meeting in February will allow the Siting Board members to reflect on comments received and deliberate about potential changes between the proposed regulations and the final regulations. The second Siting Board meeting will result in the vote of the Siting Board to accept the final regulations for promulgation. The goal is for the final regulations to be promulgated in early May of 2026 for effect July 1st of 2026. The staff that's been working on the siting and permitting improvements have been working daily for more than a year to get to today. I'll speak on behalf of other Siting Board members as well as staff here at the Department of Public Utilities to say that we are so deeply grateful to the staff for the commitment, and we are grateful to all of you today for helping us make our work even better. Thank you for making time in your busy lives to be here today. I'm now delighted to introduce Undersecretary Maria Belen Power, who is going to talk about the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity's work on Mass EnviroScreen. Undersecretary Power, I will turn it to you.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubin. If we can go to the next slide, please. So thank you, Commissioner Rubin, and thank you everyone for joining us. This, like Commissioner Rubin said, has been a long sort of wait coming. We, our staff and our teams have worked really hard to come to today, and really want to thank everyone for joining us. The comments and the feedback that we've received has been critical and will continue to be critical. So thank you for taking the time to join the webinar and to give us all of the feedback necessary. As the Commissioner mentioned, my name is Maria Belen Power, and I'm the Undersecretary of Environmental Justice and Equity here at EEA. And I will be covering the Mass EnviroScreen and how it relates to our guidance on cumulative impact analysis and the subsequent Energy Facility Siting Board regulations. Sorry, so this is, no, if we can go back. Yep, perfect. So the Mass EnviroScreen is a tool and will be a key tool that supports our mandate under the 2024 Climate Act, which also formally established our office at EEA. So the 2024 climate law enshrined into law the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity and mandates us to do a couple of things. One of them is developing guidance for cumulative impact analysis and community benefit agreements and community benefit plans. So the Climate Act charges with the two responsibilities. One is drafting the guidance, but then the other one is the implementing the environmental justice principles, which are on the screen. I might have maybe they're not on the screen, apologies. But if there's anything that you can sort of remember or take away from what are the environmental justice principles, it's two key things. One is equitable, one is meaningful engagement, and the other one is equitable distribution. And so the Mass EnviroScreen is really a central tool to both of those responsibilities, the drafting the guidance, but as well as implementing those principles. It really helps us to translate environmental justice from a principle into a practical framework that informs siting and permitting decisions. And so the goal for the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity is to ensure that energy infrastructure projects are reviewed in a more holistic way, and that we have a complete understanding of how existing environmental and health burdens affect communities and how additional projects might impact and might worsen or improve those conditions. So what is the Mass EnviroScreen? The Mass EnviroScreen is a tool, a screening tool, and it is designated to identify communities with the greatest environmental burdens and social vulnerabilities. And it integrates 30 indicators across 5 major components, which I will describe in detail in a little bit. And so the purpose of the tool is to provide a consistent and data-driven process for evaluating community-level burdens and integrating those findings and feedback into siting and permitting decisions. And the tool is also meant to be an easy-to-use tool that is accessible to all, both government, as well as industry, as well as communities from all sides. And so it's really meant to be accessible. Next slide, please. So the apologies. Oh, I think I already covered this. I'm sorry. Yes, so I covered this. So the two principles. Yes, okay, great, perfect. Thank you. And so the mass and virus screen, the tool that we developed and that we're presenting, is not it's not a new concept. The first environmental screening tool was developed in California, and it was developed by their Environmental Protection Agency, and it was about 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. And it has since been replicated in other states like Michigan and Colorado. And so we retain much of the original methodology in this version, but have incorporated some additional elements to modify it to our state, to the Commonwealth. And so our office, together with our consultant, Star Luna Consulting, has been working with GIS experts. We have also engaged public health experts, community-based organizations, environmental justice advocates, as well as tribal governments. And the work has really been to refine the selection of the indicators and to ground truth the data that we're seeing. So the process really has been iterative and collaborative, and this is not the end of that collaboration. This will continue. This is meant to be a tool that is updated and that it is sort of, I guess, a live tool, but it will also be informed by the feedback and the comments and questions that we receive here today and during the public comment period. It is currently just in draft form. And so while it is live and public, I guess, it is still in development. So we are very much looking forward to all of the feedback and questions that we get from the public. And so now I will pass it over to my colleague, Saina Mashmasarmi, who will walk us through the next few slides. On to you, Saina.
Thank you, Undersecretary. We'll now explain some of the inner workings and methodology behind the tool. As Undersecretary Power mentioned earlier, at its core, the Mass Enviro Screen analyzes the intersections between climate and pollution burdens and population vulnerability. But this can further be broken down into 5 major components or categories of indicators. The first 3 components describe the types of climate and pollution burdens that community experience. These are the first 3 bullets or sub-bullets you see on the slide, and that includes environmental exposure indicators, which are based on measurements of different types of pollution that people may come into contact with, environmental effect indicators, which are based on the locations of toxic chemicals in or near communities that can cause adverse environmental conditions, and lastly, climate risk indicators, which speak to a community's level of exposure to climate hazards. The last 2 components are what are considered to be population characteristics and describe conditions that can make people or communities more vulnerable to these burdens. This includes sensitive population indicators, which measure the prevalence of physiological or health conditions in a community, and socioeconomic factor indicators, which are conditions that may increase people's stress or make healthy living difficult and decrease capacity to adapt. Next slide, please. On this slide, you'll see a table with all 30 of the indicators which inform the Mass Enviro Screen Cumulative Burden Score. As you can see here, they are separated into the group component scores by pollution and climate burden and population characteristics before going into each individual component score. So going from left to right, in terms of pollution and climate burden, we have environmental exposures, which include things like air pollutants, like fine particulate matter and ozone. Under environmental effects, we include things like proximity to hazardous waste sites or impaired water bodies. Under climate risks, we include indicators such as flood risk and extreme heat. And then we move on to the population characteristics, which for subcomponents includes sensitive populations, which looks at things or captures health factors such as rates of pediatric asthma and premature mortality. And under socioeconomic factors, we look at things such as linguistic isolation, rates of poverty, and unemployment. While we won't have time to go into detail about every indicator on this list today, within the web application that I will demonstrate later on, you'll find the accompanying technical documentation which describes each indicator in detail, the rationale for including it, the methodology for calculating it, and the source of each data set. Next slide, please. On this slide, you'll find the methodology for calculating the final score. Firstly, for each of the 30 indicators, we calculate a percentile rank across all census block groups statewide. Next, those indicator percentile ranks are averaged together within each component, so we get an average score for environmental exposures, one for environmental effects, climate risks, and so on. We then group those component scores into two main categories, the first being pollution and climate burden, and the second being population characteristics. To generate the final cumulative burden score, we multiply the burden score by the population characteristic score, and the result is a single value that represents the overall environmental and social burden for each community. These cumulative burden scores also represent percentile ranks, which means that a community score also indicates the percentage of scores in a group that are equal to or higher than a given score. For example, if a community or census block group receives a mass EnviroScreen score of 75 or higher, that means that particular community experiences cumulative burdens equal to or greater than 75% of all block groups in the state. Next slide, please. Can we move on to the next slide, please? The next one. Thank you. The result of this process and model is that on the mass EnviroScreen, higher scores indicate greater combined environmental and social vulnerability. However, to be considered an area of concern or burdened area, those communities must meet one or both of the following criteria. They must have a mass EnviroScreen score at or above the 75th percentile, or an annual median household income that is 65% or less of the statewide median. The first criterion we have chosen to retain as a threshold to be consistent with the California model for identifying burdened areas, but we have also elected to use income as an additional criterion. This is to ensure representation across the state. We saw that when we used the mass EnviroScreen score alone, that burdened areas were concentrated in urban centers, but by adding income, we have captured other places in the state which may not be as densely populated and have fewer visible environmental hazards, but also have limited capacity to respond or adapt to pollution and climate burdens. Next slide. And on this slide, you will see a screenshot of the mass EnviroScreen map currently. All the areas in red represent the designated burdened areas by either of the two criteria I mentioned on the previous slide. And based on this criteria, 34.5% of census block groups in Massachusetts would qualify as a burdened area. And when a user or project applicant selects a specific area on the map, they'll be able to view all relevant indicator data and values. But in a few slides, I will do a demonstration of the map to illustrate this in more detail. Next slide. So the mass EnviroScreen will support the cumulative impact analysis process and be the foundation for the cumulative impact analysis by identifying areas facing multiple environmental, health, and socioeconomic burdens. It'll highlight those burdened areas for deeper review during the siting and permitting process and improve transparency by showing how these different stressors overlap across communities. And more broadly, help to inform broader environmental justice and equity discussions across agencies and programs. The tool is not intended to speak to causation or liability, meaning we are not looking to prove that a specific source directly causes specific health problems or any particular source is responsible for the environmental or health effects in a given area. It does not create or replace site-specific CIA reports, and our colleagues at the DPU will explain in more detail what that will entail, but the mass and virus screen is only a portion of the total CIA process, and it does not define or necessarily define all areas affected by environmental or specific environmental risk, meaning that the tool is a snapshot of the data at one point in time, but communities are not static, they are always changing, and so it may miss certain local condition, risk, and other things which might develop in a community. And lastly, it does not correlate to regulatory thresholds because we are comparing the indicators on a statewide basis. A higher indicator value does not necessarily mean that that indicator surpasses any regulatory standards. And so before I go into the demo, the tool is supposed to be a starting point for equitable analysis and action, not an endpoint. It is meant to indicate where deeper analysis, community engagement, and ultimately mitigation is necessary, which my colleagues at the DPU will cover next in more detail. But before we move on to the next topic or go into the short Q&A, which will follow, we wanted to show what the map application looks like in its current form. And so I will ask ERG to stop sharing screen so that I can walk through a quick demonstration of the massive viral screen tool. Great. So I am now sharing screen, and the first thing you'll see when you click the link is a background or information text box, which will automatically appear. And this box provides some context about the tool, including background information on the mass and virus screen, the criteria used for designating a burden area, and a link highlighted here, which leads to the supporting documentation. This documentation goes into more detail about the methodology of the mass and virus screen, each of the indicators used in the process, and the data sets for each of the indicators. Once you exit the text box, you will see an interactive map of Massachusetts, and on this map, all of the areas that have been designated as burden areas will be highlighted in red. When you click on an individual census block group, a panel will appear with detailed information about that area. The first thing you'll see in this panel is the specific criterion by which that census block group was designated or not designated as a burden area. So you will see if it either meets or does not meet one or two of the criteria for burden areas. If you scroll further down, you will see a table that displays both the raw value for each indicator and the percentile ranking for that indicator. For this demonstration, I've selected a community that is not a burdened area to demonstrate that the same information can be found for all census block groups across the state, whether or not it has or has not been designated a burdened area, you will still have access to the same information in the panel on the left. And then before I wrap up and turn it over to Undersecretary Power, I do want to note that this is not the final version of the mapping tool. We expect that it may look a bit different once it is finalized and include many additional functionalities. For now, this demonstration is meant to help orient you to the current version as you review the accompanying CIA guidance and regulations. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Undersecretary Power. Thank you.
Thank you, Saina. I'm just having a little bit of connection. So if I start getting glitchy, I guess maybe if some of my colleagues could let me know. It keeps giving me that message. So now we have a few minutes to receive some questions and comments and answer if we have enough time. We have about 10 minutes, and so what we will do is, as it was mentioned earlier, we will take questions from folks who have their hands raised, their virtual hands raised, and those that are in the chat or in the Q&A box, we will address those in the last hour that we have for public comment. So we have three times for public comment. This one, the next one will be after the second presentation, and then the last one will be the whole hour at the end of the webinar. So if my colleagues at ERG could support me in promoting folks that have their hands raised, that would be really helpful.
Looks like first we have Sean Gonsalves. I'm going to promote you to panelist so that you can turn your webcam on and then also unmute. Oh, look like you just lowered your hand, so maybe you no longer have a question. I will instead pass it off to Kristen Mello. I'll promote you to panelist now.
Thank you so much for allowing me to ask a question. I've been looking at this tool and I'm concerned that in the more rural areas of the state, you have much larger census block groups. For example, where I live in Westfield, this new tool now omits all of the fence line communities around Barnes Air National Guard Base, particularly those residents who no longer have trees between them and the jet fuel that is burning off. They have no buffer for sound. They have no trees to filter the air anymore. They're sandwiched in between the Air Force Base and an industrial district where a battery energy storage system was already once proposed, and a gas-fired power plant was already defeated before. This area is not considered burdened in the map at all. And there are areas of low-income housing, including a resident-owned mobile home community that is very burdened, and their income is very low. But because the census block group is so large, and other residents have moved into farmland that was turned into residential land, they lost their EJ status in 2020. And this cannot be the only neighborhood in Western Mass where that has happened. And so I am very concerned that you are at the precipice of creating a tool you are calling data-driven that has fundamental problems obscuring the environmental burden in the western half of the state where poor people live. Poor, overburdened people with extra rates of cancer that are all on Mass Health. And because the 2024 enactment is moving so quickly, there is a lot of concern about siting out here in the western part of the state. And Westfield is not the only section where you're going to run into this problem, and not every other town has residents that are so engaged as to come to all these meetings at random times of day or over and over and over again to say the same things. Now, we have brought this issue forward. Mary Ann Babinski brought it forward in 2020. I started bringing it forward on the record in 2021. In 2023, we started bringing it forward every single meeting we had. We asked for EJ designation in February of 2025, officially with a 10-person petition. If you guys push forward with this, you're going to force us to get louder and more legal about our protest. Please rethink what you're doing in the western part of the state with this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen. And I do really appreciate your comment and your concerns. Like I said in the beginning, and I think I lost connection for a few minutes, but I think my colleague Saina might have said this, is that this tool is definitely not final. So the indicators that are part of the tool right now is a draft of the indicators. And so we are very, very much open to considering other indicators. The criterion of income, so there's the Mass EnviroScreen score, and then we added that second criterion of income to sort of layer on top to make sure that we're capturing low-income communities outside of the big cities or the greater Boston area. When we did the map with the first layer of the score, we realized that there was a big a gap that needed to be filled because a lot of communities in Central Mass and Western Mass were not being identified as burden, and we know that that's not true. And so we included this layer of income to make sure that we capture the communities that are not in or near the big cities, but that live really all over the Commonwealth. So I do welcome, we all welcome, but we would love very sort of ideas or specific.
So Undersecretary Power, I think you just cut out.
Do you think we should move on to the next question, or would you like to see if give it a moment?
And thank you for the response. I know that she'll come back, and I just wanted to say that out in the western part of the state, because the census block groups are so large, that even with that income, right, once you start selling off a farm somewhere and wealthy people move in, literal trailer parks are being obscured in your data. It's not okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Suzanne Conley. I'm going to promote you to be a panelist so that you can unmute and turn on your video if you'd like.
Thank you, Jonathan, and I'd like to thank everyone on this. I think I'm sorry to make a second somewhat frustrated comment in a row here, but I'm on Cape Cod. I'm from the town of Barnstable. We are in a community that's being very, very burdened by cable landings, planned cable landings, the building of substations from offshore wind farms south of Martha's Vineyard. One of my comments has to do with the indicators in the environmental space. You do not include EMF. What we're discovering already from the one offshore wind farm that is operating and transmitting electricity to land is that EMF levels are off the charts. We are talking about a duct bank carrying transmission lines from one of our beaches to a substation built to service this offshore wind farm. The EFSB approved this based on some language offered by the developer. They had modeled that EMF would be very low, and that's not what we're finding now that those turbines, some of them at least, about 19 to 21 out of 62, are spinning. We consider very high EMF levels to be a health hazard. And there's enough data out there to indicate that. So given that so much of this infrastructure that this state wants to build in the coming years has to do with electricity, everything from the wind farms to the solar farms to the battery storage installations, it all has to do with electricity. And I'm really asking that you rethink the failure to include EMF as one of the indicators. That's about all I have to say, except that when the slides are being shown, sometimes the screen with the speaker is blocking all of Cape Cod, and then on other slides it's blocking words. So I'm wondering if when the slides are up, if the speaker view can be somehow turned off so that we can see the whole slide. And I know you're going to share the slide deck in its entirety, but I'm still interested in seeing Cape Cod when you put one of those slides up. It's just completely blocked. So, but anyway, I do want you to seriously consider the question of EMF. Thank you very much.
Just from a technical standpoint, Suzanne, you may need to just check your view options in the top right-hand corner.
Okay.
You may have just a different type of view on. You can change the setup to be a view bar that's along the top instead of something that's overlaying with the screen.
I'll try playing with that. It's just been frustrating when the maps are up. But anyway, I don't want that to detract from the comments I made about EMF, because it's really something I think that's going to hit the news very soon. HHS has indicated their worry about it, and I think it would behoove this group, as you plan the Enviro Monitor, this tool, that you need to include it. And I don't care if California didn't. I think Massachusetts should. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Maria Belén Power. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. I apologize. My laptop is giving me some trouble, and I just borrowed my colleagues. Saina, I guess we have, sorry, I'm just looking to see. I don't have the instructions next to me anymore, but I think we have a few more minutes to take more questions and comments. So I'm not sure if yeah.
It looks like we still have two more hands. Constance, I'm going to allow you to talk and move you to the panelists.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I would like to thank you for letting me speak, and I would like to underscore what both of the first two speakers, commenters, had to say. I agree with them completely. I think that there is quite a lot of concern in more rural communities. I live in Westport, and we are very much a rural community, but we are right, we're right sort of in the corridor of Fall River and New Bedford. I think that there's a lot of concern with rural communities with quote green energy siting, in that it's being done in areas that heretofore are relatively undeveloped. I know that here in Westport, we have had close to 200 acres of our woods, our forests cut down to put up solar panels. And as much as people don't want to do that here and resent it, it becomes, because the state will jam it through anyway. We have a lot of meetings about it, but we feel like we don't have any voice in it. So most of the power, this is all about electricity, most of it is going to the bigger city areas. I think it makes a lot of sense to be putting your power plants, whatever persuasion they are, near where the energy is used, so that you don't have to run cabling and infrastructure, build all of that out for hundreds of miles through areas that were heretofore unspoiled. The most important thing I think we have against climate change is to have areas such as that are wooded and that have not been ripped apart and built on. I think that is what we should be focused on in terms of trying to mitigate climate change. So I ask you, as someone that lives in a rural community, and we too have been fighting offshore wind cabling, and just offshore wind, which completely covers the horizon of our coastline now, of our beaches from here from horizon, from east to west, or all across when you look. It's heartbreaking. The lights are on all night long. I think that should also be considered, people's mental health. Anyway, thank you. I know my time is up. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, do we have one more hand? We might be able to take one more hand.
I do have one more.
We'll do that one, and then we'll move to the next agenda item, although we will have two more portions for public comment and questions. But please go ahead with the next one.
Okay, Michael, I'm going to promote you to a panelist now.
Okay, you can hear me and see me? Great, good to see you all. Thank you for doing this and thanks for the opportunity. I think I just want to continue the theme. I put this in my written comments, but to dig deeper just a little bit. So I am, when I saw cumulative impact in the law, I was very encouraged. When I look at this, I'm massively discouraged. And I think is basically the way it's currently proposed is going to create a structural green light for continued overdevelopment in rural communities. And I say that looking at the indicators. The indicators, are very much focused on public health and traditional farmed communities, but there really is not addressing what some of the other people talked about. So when I look at the map, the things that I'm, what I was encouraged about was to say there's already been lots of development of clean energy in communities. As you all heard in Pittsfield, I think Charlton has 17 versions of sites. Some communities have 10. It's very much in the central Mass and also in southeastern Mass. So when I look at this Mass Enviro screen, I don't see Charlton, I don't see Spencer, I don't see Warren in central Mass. I don't see Wareham, I don't see Carver in southeastern Mass. Those are communities that currently are overburdened by large-scale solar development and energy storage. So it's not even that the ones that will be coming won't be addressed because they're not there yet, but the ones that currently have overdevelopment are not reflected. And I think it's because the indicators, there's no indicators there. So some of the things I would suggest, which are not indicators but questions, but how many large-scale clean energy projects do you have in your community? How much acreage is it? What's the impact on water? How much clear cutting occurred? Those are things that are land use impacts that are not at all in the indicators in any place. And then I think the last thing I would just say, and I'll say this having lived in the Boston area for 12 years and living in Western Mass for quite a bit longer, it's a matter of ground truthing. So adding income and then having orange and red dots show up in communities in Western Mass does not mean that they're the right places. So there's still clusters of population. Looking at Gardner, Leominster, Greenfield, Shelburne Falls, you're probably not going to put a solar development in those locations because that's the town centers. It's the rural areas where there's open land that are more vulnerable, and those are not captured on the environmental screen currently. So those are my concerns. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Okay. I think apologies because of my technical problems, but my colleagues can maybe support if I'm going in the wrong direction. But I think right now I'm going to introduce Director Green, who will cover more of cumulative impact and from the siting board perspective. So Director Green, I'll pass it to you now.
Thank you, Undersecretary Power and Sienna. Thank you for your presentation and sort of setting the table for what comes next. which is the application of the guidance and tools that we've just been hearing about in the Energy Facility Siting Board context and the regulations that we're working on. I'm joined today in presenting our slides, as you had heard previously, by Tim Riley, who is a senior siting analyst. Daniel Kelleher, who is a presiding officer with the Siting Board, will also be talking to a few of the slides towards the end of our presentation. And other members of the siting team are here as well, and they may jump in from time to time in response to particular questions. That would include Joan Foster Evans, our general counsel, and Claire Lowe, who is also a siting analyst with our group. Okay, next slide, please. So as you've heard from Undersecretary Power, the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity has been working on developing standards and guidelines to address how cumulative impact analysis should be done by applicants in the energy siting process. And that draft document is now out for review. That really does set the sort of ground rules, if you will, for how the siting board staff have approached the question of what regulations and sort of program elements should implement those guidelines. And we have been working on this for quite some time in partnership with OEJE, and it has been a very collaborative effort. The Climate Act, requires that the Energy Facility Siting Board sort of grab the baton at this point and move forward with promulgating regulations to implement the cumulative impact analysis requirements that are in the statute. The statute requires all of our regulations to be promulgated by March 1st, and as you heard from Commissioner Rubin, we're a little bit beyond that for cumulative impact analysis. It has taken a bit more time to sort of organize our approach and develop some of the tools that you've been seeing during this webinar. So we're probably looking more towards May for promulgation of the regulations, which still will give the regulated community time, hopefully sufficient time, to understand the application of the regulations and be prepared for using the regulations and tools when opening day starts on new siting and permitting on July 1st of 2026. And again, these are previews now that hopefully are familiarizing everyone with the earlier stage thinking on our regulations, as well as the mass and virus screen tool, which really is sort of a linchpin of how applicants go about assessing cumulative impacts. We are soliciting comments on the regulations that these are draft proposed regulations, I should mention. So these are for discussion purposes. They are not formally out for public review during the sort of prescribed regulation process that will happen after we have board approval to do so in mid-December, presuming we have board approval. And so this is all, kind of preview stage, early stage feedback to help the siting division understand what the concerns or recommendations are from stakeholders and make some improvements before this is officially released for public review and comment. So this slide at the bottom outlines some of the, key components that are reflected in this draft proposed regulation. Pretty basic things and regulations, a section on definitions, and then particular to cumulative impacts, the identification of burdened areas, which, as you've heard from our colleagues at OEJE, relies on the Mass and Virus Screen and the data that is housed within Mass and Virus Screen, which is accessible through use of that tool. We go further into identification of what are called elevated indicators, which looks closely at the burdened areas that are in or near where projects are proposed for closer evaluation of what is the status of various environmental, public health and socioeconomic indicators that speak to the level of burden in the community. And then, what does the project potentially do additionally or incrementally that could, further worsen these elevated indicators, which would be a concern, obviously, for, I think, everyone. And that's one of the main reasons that there is a cumulative impact analysis. To the extent that indicators start off at the 50th percentile and go higher, that would be defined as a disproportionate adverse effect and trigger requirements for remedial measures, which includes activities to avoid, minimize, and mitigate, which we will be going into a bit further. This presentation, by the way, and we can move to the next slide. Next slide, please. So what we're going to be doing in this presentation is not just a dry recitation of what's in the regulations, which hopefully some of you have had a chance to at least glance at. We haven't had them out for very long, but hopefully there's been an opportunity to at least leaf through them and see what's in. And I know some of the commenters seem to have already referenced them, so that's encouraging, and certainly welcome the feedback. We're going to be showing how the concepts in the regulation actually are implemented by considering a illustrative project. It's a project that we actually have reviewed in the past at the Energy Facility Siting Board. It's a transmission line, and my colleague Tim Riley will go through the sort of steps involved in assessing that particular project using our proposed approach. Next slide, please. So just a few basic definitional things. Again, this is very wordy for a slide, but it is important to obviously know what are we talking about when we speak to a cumulative impact, since that is the anchor point of a cumulative impact analysis. I will mention that although the Climate Act, which obligates us to do a cumulative impact analysis, defines what a cumulative impact analysis is, there is no sort of standalone definition of the actual cumulative impact itself. And I know from many conversations that there are various kinds of interpretations of this. So, just to sort of set the table, if you will, for what we're talking about, as worded on the slide, it means the combined effects of past and present, private, industrial, commercial, state and municipal, projects, operations, development, and other economic activities, in addition to the effects of the proposed project on three things. One, the environment. Two, public health. And three, reasonably foreseeable effects of climate change. That's our, sort of, again, distillation of what's in the Climate Act. It's not expressly stated as defined right now in our regulation. And if folks think that there's a better way to define this, we're certainly interested in hearing that. The cumulative impact analysis is just the process by which we evaluate these cumulative impacts. And this is all guided now by what will be in our draft regulation or final regulation, with the earlier direction from the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity. The purpose of all of this, I think that it's probably clear by now, but it's to, again, look at the existing environmental burdens, public health consequences, and what we call specific geographical areas, which are sort of a boundary around project footprints, if you will, where we consider these, again, historical effects, the additional effects of the project, and look at the question of whether the project will add to these burdens and create what the statute defines as a disproportionate adverse effect, a level of burden that is seen as problematic and requires action on the part of both the proponent of a project and the Energy Facility Siting Board in identifying remedial actions that can help avoid, minimize, and mitigate those disproportionate effects. And I do apologize for the repetition of avoid, minimize, and mitigate, but those are very, very central concepts to what we do at the Energy Facility Siting Board. I do want to also just mention one other point, which is cumulative impact analysis is a critical component of what we will be doing in the future. It's been an area of great interest for many stakeholders for years, and I think there's a general degree of satisfaction that this has finally made it into law that will govern the siting process. What needs to be also mentioned is that the siting board, since its very inception 50 years ago, has always been about avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating environmental impacts, cost, and other aspects of projects that need to be addressed to make sure that the public is being well served by infrastructure and is benefiting from the development process and operations of these facilities and providing a necessary service. So cumulative impact is kind of a focused review on specific aspects of what we have been doing for many years. And I think one of the critical distinctions is that rather than looking at one-off project effects of noise, visual impacts, different emissions, we're really looking at these impacts, as Undersecretary Power mentioned, in a more holistic way, in totality, with not just present infrastructure that's elsewhere in the community, but also what's happened historically. Move to the next slide now. So again, a few more definitions that are critical. I did use the term specific geographical area. Think of this as a sort of boundary with a certain distance from the, if the outermost areas of a project, a proposed project. It could be the fence line for where a site is proposed. It could be the edge of a right-of-way. There are different ways to look at sort of the project footprint, and then the specific geographical area looks beyond that to a distance where there are sort of more noticeable and measurable impacts from the facility that we're trying to take into account in the cumulative impact analysis. Facility boundary, again, that's what we were just talking about for the project footprint. Census block group, this has come up already in the description of the mass enviro screen and some of the questions that were just asked. This is it's a statistical subdivision developed by the U.S. Census Bureau, and the reason that we use this both in mass enviro screen as well as a sort of basic geographic unit to identify cumulative impacts is that this is where the level of specificity, where a lot of the environmental and public health data is right now available. Other impacts that get much more location specific are not necessarily tracked by other state or government agencies. So we don't have the available data to be more granular and a sort of generally available tool that can inform us about where burdens tend to be most prevalent and projects need to take these things into account. Next slide, please. So indicators, I think this is probably also obvious to most everyone. These are statistical measurements that are used to describe the characteristics in the census blocks relating to the environmental exposures, effects, climate effects, which would be things like urban heat effects or flooding risks, things of that nature, and also the population that lives within the census block and their socioeconomic characteristics. Elevated indicators, we use this concept, and you'll hear about this from, again, Tim. But an elevated indicator is where one of the 30 indicators in mass enviro screen in a census block that the project is in or near are already considered to be problematic, i.e. they're at the median point or above of where those indicators lie on a statewide basis. And if the project is further worsening those indicators, this is a cause for concern. And again, possible remedial action. And then finally, disproportionate adverse effect is where the project will incrementally increase the extent of the elevated indicator. We may have a project location where there is an elevated indicator, i.e. it's above the 50th percentile already, but the project may have no identifiable effect, either quantitatively, qualitatively, and that would not be seen as a disproportionate adverse effect. So the key concept here is that the project has to make the indicator worse for that to be something we would regard as a disproportionate adverse effect attributable to the project. Next slide, please. There have been a few other webinars and presentations on a related concept, which is the site suitability assessment process that has been developed by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. That's still an ongoing effort. And there seems to be some confusion, I would say, among many stakeholders of what is the difference between site suitability and cumulative impact analysis. And this is very understandable because both of these systems do make use to varying degrees of the mass and virus screen tool. Both of these systems rely on different types of data or indicators, and both employ the concept of mitigation and avoidance and minimization to deal with adverse effects. So to sort of highlight what the differences really are, I would say that, as mentioned, cumulative impact analysis is focusing on the environmental impacts such as air, water, waste pollutants in communities, climate change effects, i.e. flooding risks, heat, and other climate-related outcomes, as well as the socioeconomic conditions in the community that speak to public health measurements or income and other things of that sort. So those are, the primary areas of focus for cumulative impact analysis. The site suitability system really relies, or I guess addresses more directly, some of the natural resource information that we've heard expressed in the context of it being a particular rural area concern. This might be indicative of carbon sequestration, i.e. forests and impacts of projects on forested areas and soils that can store carbon. Development potential is another area of focus in site suitability that's unique in terms of whether projects are being built on previously disturbed areas, landfills, industrial areas, or whether they're making use and potentially reducing the amount of protected natural resource areas and things of that sort. So that's a distinguishing feature of the site suitability system. Biodiversity is also another area where site suitability really zeroes in on that as a potential concern about where the project is located and what impact it may be having in disrupting animal habitat, flora, fauna, and being a concern from the biodiversity perspective. And agricultural resources, another area of focus for site suitability. So there really are some distinctions, but to the extent that mass and virus screen is used for both of these systems, it is used for 100% of the indicators that feed into the cumulative impact analysis. It supplies about 20% of the data inputs that go into site suitability. So a difference in the degree of emphasis. Next slide, please. So this slide and the next one sort of shows, when does cumulative impact analysis apply? When does site suitability scoring apply? And the main message here is that generally speaking, there's either a requirement for a full cumulative impact report, which includes identification of burdened areas and measures to mitigate disproportionate adverse effects. Or if that is not the case, and that the project is not near a burdened area, or has other characteristics, a site suitability scoring result would be needed, but typically not both. So for transmission and distribution projects, if that project happens to be in or near a burdened area and the project does have a disproportionate adverse effect, the full scope of the EFSB CIA regulation would apply. If the project happens to not be near a burdened area and it may be in a newly developed public right-of-way, then that would be a situation where a site suitability score would be required instead. For clean energy generation, it's somewhat similar, that if, let's say, a solar farm or anaerobic digesters or wind farms are near burdened areas, then the full cumulative impact analysis is required. If that is not the case, and we're not, in an area where there is a burdened area as defined in the regulations, then site suitability scoring, and again, its different focus would apply. And I know this is a particular concern in many rural parts of the state, so we're expecting to have some questions and discussion about that after the presentation. For storage projects that typically are battery facilities, again, same general idea. If you're near a burdened area as defined in the mass and virus screen, then there would be a requirement for the full cumulative impact assessment. And if not, site suitability scoring would apply. Next slide, please. So one other thing to point out about the requirements in the Climate Act for cumulative impact analysis, for the siting board, it's not just limited to the clean energy infrastructure facilities. The legislature decided that cumulative impact analysis was an essential part of siting board review, and they directed that the board conduct CIA for all projects that we review. So this would include clean energy infrastructure. It would include facilities that we call legacy facilities that typically are associated with fossil fuel use, such as a power plant that might burn natural gas, or a natural gas pipeline, or a liquefied natural gas storage facility. There will be cumulative impact requirements on all of these facilities, and this is something that I know that many stakeholders have been eagerly awaiting this moment. The application is somewhat similar, that if these legacy projects are near burdened areas, the full requirements of CIA would apply. If we're not in the vicinity, or if the project is not in the vicinity of a burdened area, then the cumulative impact analysis would be fairly limited, and just observe the lack of overlapping with burdened areas. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to turn the presentation over now to my colleague Tim Riley, who is going to sort of show how CIA applies in the context of a illustrative project.
Thank you, Director Green, and hello, everybody, and thank you for attending today. I will be describing the CIA process further in more detail, and also, as Director Green indicates, a example project. And one thing I think that's important to note is that the CIA process, while a key tool, is one tool. There are other aspects of environmental evaluation that the board does and that applicants are expected to do. And we'll talk about that as well. I think that's a critical point. All applicants are expected to, for the types of projects just described by Director Green, to conduct the CIA. And while they conduct it and they produce a CIA report, the board does evaluate it. And let's go through a process now to show how that might work. Next slide, please. So the example project is the we call it the Sudbury Hudson project. It was a project that was evaluated and adjudicated several years ago, around 2019 or so. It's about an 8 to 10 mile long underground. The preferred route and what was actually approved was an underground transmission line in an old rail bed, basically, and that connected two expanding substations, one in Sudbury and one in Hudson. And there were three actual main routes selected among many routes originally. There was a route that was through a bunch of streets, and then there were two routes in this old rail bed. One was underground, the preferred route, and then one was an overhead. The notice alternative was or notice variation was an overhead route. And so these three routes touched or overlapped with over 20 census block groups, and there's specific geographical areas. So we would have to look at those in terms of, are there any burdened areas within that? And I think it's important to also note here that the CIA would be only conducted for the preferred alternative, the notice alternative, if there was one. In this case, there was, and the notice variation, and there was one. So we're not expecting the applicant to look at 35 candidate routes that they start off with when they're evaluating that. We're looking at the ones that are most seriously considered by the applicant. Next slide, please. And so the first step in this is to identify the specific geographical area based on the facility boundary. And as Director Green indicated, this facility boundary is the outer boundary of the project. And then from that, we look at radiating outwards what the actual radial distance is from the boundary. The Climate Act did not list explicit radial distances for specific geographical areas. And so we're proposing in the regulation that they be based on energy technologies. And so you can see in this table here that from the facility boundary radiating out would be these different radial distances that comprise these so-called specific geographical areas. So I'll let you take a look at that for a moment. So why don't we go on to the next step? These then are used then to identify the actual area of area of impact of the project. So next slide, please. As an example of how this would work, for example, for the so-called SUDHUD project, the first step is to identify the facility boundary. And here we have for the transmission lines, it would be the edge of the right-of-way, would be the facility boundary for the transmission lines. And for the substations, that's a different type of energy technology. That would be the substation fence line. And then we would use the regulation, which was basically described in the previous slide with the table, that shows the actual specific geographical areas. And in this case, a specific geographic area for the transmission line is a 1/4 mile out from the right-of-way edge, and the substation is a 1/2 mile out from the facility boundary. And this is really a good example of how in one project you have different energy technologies, in this case, transmission lines and substations, so you can have different specific geographical areas within one project. Next slide, please. So then the next step, based on where the so-called area of impact, these specific geographical areas are, is to determine if they overlap with the burdened areas. Step 2 of the process basically answers, does the SGA overlap any of the burdened areas from Mass EnviroScreen? And this is a geographic overlay exercise then of comparing where the SGA is and the burdened areas are in the Mass EnviroScreen map. And currently we are working on developing a drawing tool to either draw or upload a shapefile onto the master virus screen website so that an overlay analysis can really readily be done. And if there is no overlap, though, then as Director Green indicated, that sort of terminates the analysis, as it were, the CIA analysis, and a concise CIA report is still developed and included with the application. But if there is any overlap, then in fact, a full formal CIA is conducted, and we'll describe those in the next few steps. Next slide, please. So here we have the project, the two substations on each end, and the transmission line. Again, this ended up being an underground transmission line, and the associated SGAs. And as Sienna showed in the initial OEJE presentation, the red areas are the burdened areas. So this is an overlay on the massive virus screen map. And you can see in the upper northwest end of the project, there is an overlap of one of the burdened areas, and then it has a very specific census block group number. And you can see that we have an actual output of that, and the massive virus screen burdened area percentile score is 85, which exceeds the 75. And it indicates then that of those 30 indicators, some of them must be really quite high to have an averaging of 85.6. We also look at the median household income. And again, the criteria there is 65% or less of the state median household income. And here we see that, well, the median household income is 84%. So it's higher than the criterion. So that would not mean that it's a burdened indicator. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we see that we need to conduct a full CIA analysis because we did overlap with the burdened indicator. And we've gone from now the 31 indicators down to 30 because the median household income has dropped out. So somewhere in those 30 indicators, there's the map that you saw, the graph that you saw before of all those indicators. Some of those must be elevated indicators. And so we need to determine which ones of those are elevated indicators. And now this is where a really important point here. We have all these various indicators, but there's been questions as why isn't this indicator in there? Why isn't that indicator in? As well, the reason is that there are specific criteria for whether an indicator should be included or not. You know, is it publicly available? Is it available on a statewide basis? Does it provide a meaningful comparison of sites and other criteria? Then these are in the regulations. And so some indicators that could potentially be included are not included because they don't meet the criteria. And in those situations, as in years past, as Director Green indicates, the applicant does do a siting analysis, a site scoring or a route scoring to compare all these other indicators, ecological indicators, land use indicators, constructability, historical resources, endangered species, and very specific indicators. So it becomes then somewhat independent of the size of the census block group. It's really very place-based, and it's to compare then the different sites or routes based on all these other indicators. So just because they're not within mass and virus screen does not mean that they are not looked at. So we look at these indicators, and next slide. We decide, we see which indicators are so-called elevated indicators. And as was defined earlier, an elevated indicator is one which is median or 50th percentile or higher in terms of burden. So next slide, please. So we find of these 30 indicators, we are now down to these 15 indicators. These are the indicators, and you can see the percentile scores are all at 50 or higher, which means that they're more burdened than more than 50% of the state, or the 70% of the state, or 56% of the state, as you can see, these different indicators. So these are the then 15 indicators that we go forward with into step 4 of the analysis to determine what the project impacts are. So we've now gone from 31 indicators down to 15 indicators for further evaluation, because these are elevated indicators. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this step then, with these so-called elevated indicators in burdened areas, we identify what the project impacts are. And the anticipated impacts take into account things like the degree of impact, spatial extent of the impact, or the duration of the impact, and the nature of the impact. And the project impact evaluation that we look for from applicants it could be qualitative or quantitative. And where quantitative measurements of indicator impact, project impacts on an indicator are possible, then those are strongly recommended, because the applicant needs to provide some kind of documentation to support their findings of why they think a project might be impacted or not. What kind of project impacts are we looking at? We'd like to know about each of these elevated impact indicators, and we look at each of them individually. You know, does a project yield a positive impact on an indicator? In other words, does it benefit? Because in some cases, there may be benefits from the project. This is, in fact, clean energy after all. There might be also no impacts, or just not applicable. The project will have no impacts whatsoever on the project. There also may be de minimis adverse impacts, like very negligible impacts that aren't subject to being measurable or anything. But there also may be impacts that are materially adversely exacerbate the condition of the indicator. In other words, significant impacts to the adverse impacts to the indicator. Applicants must provide a rationale. Well, why did they find, what the impacts are? And they also must provide supporting documentation, somewhere in the application filing or appended to the CIA report. What's their rationale, and what's the supporting documentation to support their finding of impacts? Next slide, please. And this becomes very important. I'm going to read this, that the applicant assesses if the project results in a disproportionate adverse effect related to the indicator. And the project will result in a disproportionate adverse effect if the project causes a negative impact that is likely to materially exacerbate the condition reflected in the indicator. What do we really mean by that? What do we mean by materially exacerbate? To materially exacerbate an elevated indicator, a project must cause an additional negative impact that is more than de minimis impact. Such a disproportionate adverse effect could be readily perceptible in the affected burdened areas through everyday experience of residents, or through quantitative metrics, including data collection and measurement. So in other words, these are significant impacts that somehow adversely impact the indicators in a measurable way or a perceptible way by the residents of the area. Next slide, please. So we take those 15 indicators, and this is an example from, again, the Sudbury Hudson project, and we look at the indicators, and this summarizes the nature, the degree, and the spatial extent and duration of impacts of the elevated indicators occurring in the burdened area. Those indicators which are materially adversely exacerbated by the proposed project are considered disproportionate. And you can see in the second column to the right, is it disproportionate or not? Yes or no. The applicant also has to identify the project phase where the disproportionate effects happen. So in this case, for example, PM25, this seems to happen during construction. Next slide, please. We also have disproportionate effects for chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder and pediatric asthma. also during the construction phases. If this had continued on in operations, it would be construction and operations. But in this particular case, due to diesel fueled heavy machinery, this happens really only during the construction phase. And so all three of these, of the 15 indicators, we have 3 that are disproportionately adversely affected, really due to emissions from heavy machinery powered by diesel fuel. Next slide, please. So what do we do with that? Well, for those indicators which are disproportionately adversely affected, we propose remedial actions to address those disproportionate adverse effects. And here, as Director Green indicated, we use the applicant uses the mitigation hierarchy of avoidance, minimization, and mitigation of impacts to identify, and also to identify and have a nexus with and right size the types of remedial actions to address those discovered impacts. And these remedial actions are proposed by the applicant in the CIA report. The applicant must provide the supporting document which describes the rationale and sizing of the remedial action, including how and why the proposed action proportionately addresses identified disproportionate adverse effects, including a nexus of the project impacts to the remedial action. So there's got to be some kind of relationship that the remedial action does something to ameliorate or avoid or minimize or mitigate for those discovered effects. So next slide, please. Thanks. So now we've gone from 31 indicators to 30 to 15 elevated indicators, now to 3 disproportionately adversely affected indicators. And then we have some kind of remedial actions to address that using that mitigation hierarchy. And here, this table summarizes those remedial actions. For example, for avoidance, the applicant may propose electrification of construction vehicles and equipment as feasible to reduce emissions. For minimization, the preferred alternative was, again, in an old rail bed that is away from most houses and not in the streets. So that would be off-road construction and would reduce traffic and emissions to population areas. So that's how they would minimize it. And they might mitigate it because remember, this was a underground transmission line. They would propose a rail trail that basically reduces motor vehicle use and associated emissions because people are walking and biking there. The last column then provides a rationale for how does electrification and rail trails and construction away from populations reduce emissions, and that all is described in that last column. And again, this is a summary slide. We would expect that the applicant would have additional remedial action specifications and description of how in fact their remedial actions would really address the discovered issue with PM 2.5 emissions. Next slide, please. We do the same thing with chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder issues too, and they look quite a bit because, again, all these really are emission sort of related to, in this case, a sensitive receptor population, those people with COPD. Again, it's electrification of construction vehicles. This time for minimization, in addition to constructing away from population centers, we also employ dust control best management practices that reduces the amount of particles in the air and the respiratory irritants. Again, a rail trail for mitigation, and then a description of rationale how these kinds of remedial actions would address COPD sensitivity from the project. And similarly, next slide, please. We do the same thing for pediatric asthma, which is really very similar. Again, we have a respiratory sensitivity. So we have electrification of vehicles and equipment, dust control, off-road construction, and rail trails. Again, the idea here being that a project would, an applicant would provide additional supplementary information to describe what this really is. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague, Daniel Kelleher, and he's going to describe a CIA report contents, additional board review, and next steps. Daniel?
Thank you, Mr. Riley. So for all projects for which a CIA is required, the applicant must submit a CIA report. And the report will closely follow the steps that Mr. Riley just outlined, and those steps correspond with the regulation, the proposed draft regulations. The board is currently in the process of developing a CIA report template to guide applicants in efficiently preparing a streamlined report. The template goes step by step. The report will call for the applicant to incorporate information into the report that the applicant has gathered from its engagement with the public before it has filed the application. Next slide, please. The board is charged in the draft regulations with ensuring the CIA report meets regulatory criteria. The board will assess whether the applicant conducted a comprehensive CIA analysis in accordance with the regulations. Also, the board will assess whether the applicant appropriately and proportionately incorporated the mitigation hierarchy into its analysis. The draft regulations, which follow the statute in this regard, specifically charge the board with finding, one, whether the applicant has given due consideration to the cumulative impact of the project. And the board must also find whether the applicant has adequately undertaken actions to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any disproportionate adverse effects from the project. Under the draft proposed regulations, the board may, as part of its assessment, consider the applicant's use of a community benefit plan or a community benefit agreement and the benefits those documents confer upon the host community. Next slide, please. So these anticipated procedural steps, a number of them have been covered already. We're targeting that that the regulations will apply to applications that are filed July 1, 2026 or later. And there have been steps built into the process that are either part of the formal rulemaking process that are required by law, or that are optional, and they give more of an opportunity for the public to offer comment. I'll just say that the formal the process starts after the board has approved the proposed regulations, and they end up being filed with the Secretary of State's office on December 19th. I think the other highlights from this chart were already covered primarily by Commissioner Rubin. So next slide, please. And I assume this goes back to Director Green.
Thank you, Mr. Kelleher. We're just about where we're supposed to be taking a break, but I think I see a lot of questions in the chat box or the Q&A box, and maybe we could, again, just provide a few minutes now to take a few questions, and then we'll come back after the break, and we have an hour for extensive questions and answers. So if you have your hand raised, we can promote you to the panel and hear your questions and respond. I'm not seeing anybody right now with a hand raised. There we go.
All right, Tristan Thomas, I will promote you to panelist.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the presentation, in particular the example and walking through. That was very helpful for understanding the regulations and guidance. My question is relative to the information that developers would have to submit. I appreciated the explanation of how their particular mitigation measures would address the the elevated indicators and the aspects of the community that they need to work towards. I'm curious what quantitative data that they might have to submit in addition to the explanation. I'm thinking about the EFSB and its role evaluating whether or not the mitigation measure is adequate. And so taking the specific example of PM 2.5, how much reduction in air emissions with the mitigation measure of switching to electric vehicles and taking the rail trail. I think that piece of information is critical in order for EFSB, in order to be able to make that evaluation of adequacy. And so I guess the question is, in general, what kinds of quantitative data are you requiring and what kinds of data do you need in order to make that determination?
Mr. Riley, would you like to respond to that?
Sure, thank you. And Tristan, that's an excellent question. Obviously, all projects are a little bit different, so there's not a one size fits all. But for example, in the past, there's been air quality modeling that, because of course, you're projecting. Again, all of these are projections, right? We are projecting what the impacts of a project might be on a particular indicator in the case of, for example, emissions, which is vis-a-vis the COPD, the asthma, and the PM 2.5, that there could be air quality modeling of, we make the presumptions of these types of equipment out there, resulting in these localized isocontours of various types of hydrocarbon emissions, including PM 2.5. And so then we could look at those concentrations in space and time compared to various health standards. And so the mitigation might be, let's say, I don't know, I'm just making an example that there's a lot of tree cutting and emissions from tree cutting along the rail trail, and that the modeling shows these kind of emissions in these areas or to very sensitive populations. So then the projects would be aimed at reducing those emissions to safe levels for at-risk populations. So that's one way that a quantitative data could be employed, if that makes sense.
If I could just add a postscript to that. When we're talking about air emissions from the construction phase, we should recognize that DEP, has a primary responsibility for air pollution regulation. They have cumulative impact analysis regulations. The type of impacts that we're talking about with this Sudbury Hudson project do not rise to the level where DEP's cumulative impact analysis is activated. This is not a major source of air pollution during construction, negligible, if any, during operational phase. So we're really, when we talk about quantitative measurement, we're really talking about relatively small quantities relative to the tools that are used by regulators like DEP when they permit larger facilities. So this tends to be, sort of more ad hoc type analysis rather than standard air emission models and things of that sort. And as far as trying to get a handle on, what the benefits might be or the mitigative effects of the rail trail that has been developed as a byproduct of the transmission line. We would be looking at information like avoided vehicle miles traveled, or trips reduced, and using some sort of an emission factor for an average or typical vehicle that, again, would not have been driven, and gauging an air quality benefit that might offset some of these construction impacts. That's a long-term benefit, obviously, since the rail trail is present after the project is completed and will hopefully provide value to the community for decades to come. I think we have another question.
I see, Tristan, you have your hand back up again. You do have a
Yeah,
little
I
bit
just
more
want
time.
thank you. That answered the question. I just had a quick follow-up. In the analysis that EFSB does, is that public information, and is that posted during as part of the process? And then lastly, how does enforcement work around tracking compliance with any committed mitigation measures?
Excellent question. Yes, the information that is submitted to the siting board with the application is public. We have a publicly available file room, and anyone can access it and get the source documents. We're actually hoping to make some significant improvements in the electronic file room repository so that it's easier to find what you're looking for. And again, as a member of the public, use that to participate in the case, however it is that you choose to do so. As far as the sort of question of enforcement, the siting board typically imposes many, many conditions on projects that it approves that will be changing with the new siting and permitting system, where the board will now be issuing a variety of different permits that cover state and local agencies. These will all have conditions that will be enforced not only by the siting board, but also by some of our sister state agencies or local government, depending on the type of permits that are required for approval of the project. And we do pay very close attention to the conditions and making sure that they are observed by applicants who become facility operators when the project is built. So very important issue, and something that we are quite focused on, and again, looking for ways to make that service and oversight more effective. Mr. Di Chiara is raising his hand. Can we move Michael Di Chiara to the panel, please?
Yes, we can.
I think we'll be taking our break after this question or so.
All right, Michael, you should be able to talk.
Okay, you guys can see and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thanks for recognizing me, Andy. I just had 3 points before the break. One was I was struck by one of the slides that you had in terms of comparing cumulative impact and site suitability, because I think it confirmed what I understood, which is they're not duplicative, they're complementary. So, they're looking at different things. And so it continues to puzzle me why, as far as I can tell, there's no situation where both would be used. And especially if there's a community impact assessment determined, that means it's a burdened area. One would assume that site suitability would be really relevant. So that's just, I would encourage that there should be situations where both are employed, especially if they're looking at different pieces of information. It doesn't strike me that that's the case. That's sort of number one. I was also struck, I know when Tim was talking about indicators, he mentioned a few criteria for why indicators made it into the mass and virus screen. And from what I heard, I could be wrong, but I heard that one of the criteria is if it's publicly available or not. And I think that's an insufficient criteria, it makes it harder. But because it's not publicly available, doesn't mean it's not important. And so I think there might be an alternative way to capture things that are important, because what the mass EnviroScreen is doing is the filter, and you get a score. And depending on the score, you get looked at one way or another. And if something that's important can't be quantified and measured, it doesn't mean it's off the books. It just means that it makes it harder. So I think it's a tall order for you guys to figure out how to do that. I also think it's one of the failings or the things, shortcomings with the site suitability for EEA, that their underlying data on site suitability is what's publicly available. It's not necessarily, like I think about the siting part, there's mostly flooding. There's a lot of other things, but they have flooding information, so that's what they're measuring. So I think it's a mistake to sort of be led by what's available for data, as opposed to stepping back and saying, what are we trying to prevent or protect or achieve as a goal? So, and then the last thing I would say, and I've sort of suggested this to DOER as well in some of their processes, but it strikes me that, you know, when I listen to it, it sounds like you guys are trying to do your due diligence. And I recognize that both EFSB and DOER and EA has limited capacity for all this stuff. But for the applicant to be able to self-assess whether an elevated indicator becomes a disproportionate adverse effect, it really should be a third party of some sort that, you know, you can hire, or EFSB is taking that on. And so one would assume there's a methodology, and maybe you can't fudge it too much, but you got to presume that any applicant is going to try to make their situation look better than not. And so asking them to say, hey, there's an elevated indicator, does that rise to the level of occasion of adverse effect or not? They're not predisposed to be doing that, because that makes their life harder. So asking them to self-assess their own situation without some kind of oversight, I would think for integrity's sake, you'd want to check their logic, but why don't you start the process by having a third party? So again, I thank you for squeezing me in before the break, and it's good to see everybody. Appreciate it.
So thank you for the questions, Mr. DiChiara. So there are three things that you just raised, CIA versus site suitability. Why not both, I think, was your question, since they seem to be complementary and are getting at slightly different questions and impacts of the project. I think that's a fair point. I think what we've seen in the development of the two systems is that they do focus largely on different things and emphasize different kinds of concerns that do have a cumulative nature to them, if you will. And I would say site suitability probably has more importance and hits a lot of the issues that we're hearing more from rural parts of the state that are more heavily forested or agricultural, since those are two specific indicator categories that are currently not reflected in the cumulative impact system. So, you know, it's also fair to say that the indicators in cumulative impact analysis that deal with public health tend to be more elevated in urban areas. So there is a bit of a dichotomy between CIA and site suitability. So I think it's a fair question whether they both serve a purpose and ought to be considered in tandem, or whether, you know, the one or the other approach is more appropriate to avoid what might be seen by some as duplication or, you know, sort of over-regulation. But those are questions. Public data, you indicated you wouldn't necessarily draw the bounds at what's publicly available. Here we have a lot of cooks in the kitchen at OEJE, their consultant, our staff, and trying to come up with the sort of optimum characteristics for indicators that belong in a data set that we can all use and reflect on. And, you know, if I will say that if we're dealing with proprietary information that somehow has restrictions or is not really you know, being refreshed frequently enough or has other constraints, it does have some limitations in its use in a, you know, sort of publicly visible process that we use at the siting board to review facilities. So, you know, again, publicly available data has advantages, but it does not cover all conceivable indicators, which is your point. And
Andy, can I just jump in quick? It's not a matter of proprietary versus public. It's sort of, is it being measured somewhere in the public realm? So, this is totally off the charts, but like, how would you measure happiness? Like someone has tried to quantify that, but it's a very subjective kind of thing. There's things that don't get measured, but I think in terms of cumulative impact, the way you defined it, there's some things that are just hard to measure. It's not that it's proprietary, it's just difficult to put a number on it. But that's what I'm saying is those things, like using that example, happiness is important. How do you measure that? So cumulative impact is important. There's elements of that that are important that are not easily measurable. And so the fact that those hard to measure things are not in the metrics is the issue.
I get your point. And part of the effort from this point forward is to get input like that and see whether we've missed some opportunities to include other indicators in mass EnviroScreen in our regulatory proposal that, again, really help deliver on the intent of the statute, which is to identify environmental, public health, socioeconomic impacts of projects and what's preceded them in the communities where they're being proposed. The last point I do want to address, your third point, Mr. DiChiara, which was, should applicants be the ones to make their own self-assessments of whether they have a disproportionate adverse effect? Should there be a third party who has a role in reviewing this? This discussion is familiar because it's happening in the context of the site suitability scoring and the possible use of a third party as opposed to just the applicant. I will say this, that any information that comes to the board for review in an application is not taken at face value as being fact. It is scrutinized by our team. It is subject to very extensive scrutiny by stakeholders who include community organizations, local government officials, other state agencies that will have a very important role in the process that takes place at the board. So there's evidence is reviewed and scrutinized and really needs to be validated before it's accepted as fact. That's part of the regulatory process, and that may not give you the full assurance of a third-party reviewer, but it does lead to the same result of a vetting of information rather than just the sort of label that the applicant chooses to put on things.
Yeah, and I know that EFSB would vet it, like that's what you guys do. You're professional at looking at that stuff. And I don't have any doubt about that. It's sort of the starting point.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry. It looks like we have an interpreter in the English room. So if you all of our interpreters check their channels, that would be great. Apologies, go on.
Sure. And just the last thing I was going to say is in terms of being reviewed by municipalities or other state agencies, et cetera, it's then sort of putting the burden on other stakeholders to do that proactive response, poking at the facts, where I think if the starting point was, here's a disinterested party who's presenting this stuff and then everyone can look at it, it's a little bit less defensive in terms of how one's looking at the data. But I have assurances that EFSB is going to take its due diligence. That was never the question in my mind.
Again, it's an idea that is already being discussed in this related program of site suitability. So I think it's fair game for discussion for us going forward. We are just a little after 4 o'clock. We've completely exhausted the pre-scheduled break time. Should we take a break now, maybe for a shorter time, 10 minutes, and come back at 4:10 and take some more questions? Or how about 4:15? I think that's just a little bit more than 10 minutes. Yes? Okay. We'll see you all back at 4:15.
Looks like folks are back. Do we want to get started with the Q&A?
Yeah, Andy, I think we can get started, right? Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay. Why don't we start off with if there are any federal, state, or local officials, we would like to recognize them. It's hard for me to see the whole list of participants, so it would be great if you can raise your hand if you are, though there might be sort of thinking this out loud, Andy, but we could just also take the raised hand questions.
I don't see any hands raised in response to the presence of federal, state, or local officials who'd like to comment or ask a question. But last call on not just elected public officials, we should say. Are there any present on Zoom who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Please raise your hand. Okay, not seeing anyone. Oh, here we go. We have Lori Degnan of the Charlton Planning Board.
All right, Lori, I'm promoting you to panelist.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Yes, Lori Degnan, Charlton Planning Board. I just had a quick comment that Mr. DeChara mentioned. Your maps don't show any existing projects. They don't show any proposed projects or power plants. So that would be really helpful to get a sense, because I know all this tool you're giving your board, they're going to use to evaluate the project. So it would be nice that it have more information. And then I do want to be able to, as a municipality, be able to add to the information to make a valid site assignment and cumulative impact. Because being a resident of town over 60 years, I know what's been going on all these years, and even before computers. So having something be publicly available only lets you know that what actually made the reporting. So just a couple points. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. We'll go to the next raised hand.
I'm not seeing any other raised hands at the moment.
I think we have a couple. Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
I was just going to say we have quite a few questions that have shown up in the chat feature, and Claire Lowe of the Siting Board Division, Siting staff rather, is going to turn to those and give us some questions.
Yep, thank you. So I've gone ahead and arranged the questions by topic. So starting with questions on the mapping tool, is Mass and Virus Screen available as a feature service or shapefile? And relatedly, will the burdened area GIS layer be made available for download before comments are due?
The map is publicly available. Is the question what? Sorry, Claire. I think is the question whether it can be downloaded?
Yes, I think the question is about if the GIS layer itself can be downloaded and potentially used in people's individual GIS softwares.
Saina, you might have, I'll pass it to you from OEG.
Yep, thank you. At this time, the map is not available, or the data behind the map is not available for download, and we don't anticipate that it will be made available before comments close on November 17th. Thank you.
All right, next question on the mapping tool. Is the burden area map the same as the environmental justice area map?
And I can take that one. It is not. It is a different map. So the EJ map, I guess the one that that we have right now, the EJ population map, is based on the 2021 roadmap law, and it includes demographic criteria. This MES, the Mass Enviro Screen, is the new tool that was developed for this purpose. So it is not the same, it's not the same map. It has very different indicators and categories.
I do see a hand raised now, so I don't know if we want to continue with some written questions or go to the raised hand.
Why don't we take the person whose hand is raised?
All right, Andrea, I'm going to promote you to panelist.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. Yeah, I just want to say a big kind of thank you to Undersecretary Power, Commissioner Rubin, and EFSB members for providing a lot of great information on how you breaking down the regulations as well as the guidance that just came out last week. And I think the indicators are very helpful, especially in outlining the impacts both historically and present and in the future on public health and climate impacts on people. And I think it's pretty consistent with what is out there with the EPA. My question has to do mostly around the guidance, which I think is around step 3. And I'm going to quote the guidance, but it says that project applicants should engage with key stakeholders to discuss conditions on the ground and lived experiences in order to validate and contextualize the data gathered from the mass enviro screen. And I'm just wondering, like, what will that engagement look like? Like, how is the EFSB and others conceptualizing what that engagement look like? And will the project applicants be required to include the public engagement in their cumulative impact analysis report during filing? Thanks.
Thank you, Andrea. Andy, I'll pass it to you for this one.
Andrea, I think you were probably reading from the OEJE guidance document. But I can address it, but maybe you want to just start off at least under Secretary Power in terms of the origin of that phrase, and we can talk about how it's implemented.
Yeah, I mean, the idea comes from one of the 2 principles, which is meaningful engagement. And so making sure that the project proponents are meeting with all the different stakeholders. And that will be part of the pre-filing, which is why I sort of was looking to Andy. But you're right, it is sort of part of the guidance as well as part of the regulatory process.
And as far as how that is implemented at the EFSB, it is the pre-filing stage where the applicant would be presenting the proposed project to the community, including the key stakeholders that you were just referencing, and getting input from members of the community in terms of what they're seeing and experiencing under current circumstances before a project is built and operating, as well as what concerns they might have about the additional impacts of the project. That information will have relevance to the CIA report that gets filed. So we do value that sort of anecdotal, if you will, information from the community, because sometimes the folks who live there just know better than any publicly available data source. They see it, they feel it and hear it every day. So we want that insight, and that is relevant to the board's review. Claire, would you want to give us another question?
Yes, we had another Mass Enviro Screen question come in. How often will the data in the Enviro Screen tool be updated? I noticed that on the 2020 EEA Environmental Justice Population Mapper, it says that the demographic information is based on US Census Bureau data from 2022.
Yeah, so that's definitely something we were thinking about. We have not, we've sort of talked through whether it should be every 1 year, every 5 years. I think it really depends on the data that's available. And so we are still thinking through the timeline that would make sense for it to be practical. for the folks that are updating the map and the tools, as well as balancing that with the data that is available and how often it becomes available. There are 30 indicators that we are looking at right now. So it's something we are thinking through right now, but we haven't landed in a specific place.
Next, we have some questions on the indicators. What is the threshold for an elevated indicator? And is an indicator only considered elevated if it is within a burdened community?
Diane, I'm going to pass that one to you.
Thank you. For the purposes of the CIA report, an indicator is considered an elevated indicator when it surpasses the 50th percentile. And so since we are talking about it as it relates to the CIA process, that is the definition of an elevated indicator. But I will see if Tim or Andy has anything to add to that.
Tim, please jump in.
No, I don't really have anything to add to that. It's an elevated indicator. It occurs at the median of burden for the state, which is the 50th percentile, at or above the 50th percentile.
I'll just add one thing, which is that an elevated indicator relates to a particular burdened area. So an indicator can be an elevated indicator for one burdened area, provided it's at or above the 50th percentile, but not an elevated indicator for another burdened area in which it's below, below the 50th percentile.
Thank you, Mr. Kelleher.
Another question related. In the example SUDHUD project Tim is discussing, would the CIA also address project contributions to non-elevated indicators? And if not, how does the EFSB then know whether the project would cause those indicators to become elevated as a result of the project? For example, if the applicant only has to consider PM 2.5 and traffic as elevated indicators, but the project will create so much noise that it will cause the indicator to exceed the 50th percentile, will noise be evaluated too?
Tim, would you like to address that?
Sure. Well, one thing that's true is that we do look at, and we encourage applicants to look, certainly to focus their efforts on burdened areas, but for context, burdens that extend past the borders of the census block group, and also benefits that extend past the census block group for that matter. You know, we look to applicants to provide context to what is happening in the area from the project. So while the focus is on the census block group, this burdened census block group, we do look for context outside the borders as well. And the other thing, again, that the CIA is but one tool in the overall environmental impact assessment evaluation of a power project. That in fact, we do look at indicators other than CIA indicators, for sure, ecological indicators, historical indicators, etc., land use indicators, and that we look at that outside of burdened areas, all throughout the areas of perceived impact from a project. So again, I think it's important to understand that the CIA is an important tool. It is required in many cases, but it is only but one tool for environmental impact assessment, and certainly considered outside of the burdened areas.
There was one other part to the question that I'd like to address, which is, what if you have a burdened area with an indicator that's not quite an elevated indicator? Maybe it's at the 48th percentile rather than being at the 50th percentile for maybe PM 2.5. And we should have decoded that earlier. That's particulate matter, fine particulate matter, 2.5 microns or less. And, as we were discussing earlier, many clean projects will have a sort of difficult to measure impact. They're not susceptible to some of the standard air modeling tools or other tools that are often used in environmental analysis and regulation. So it's hard to say with precision, whether many clean energy projects are going to elevate the project beyond that 50th percentile, i.e. into the elevated indicator range. Since cumulative impact analysis is relevant to fossil fuel projects that we continue to review, I think that that part of your question is particularly relevant. If we're looking at a fossil fuel power plant with considerable air emissions, it's certainly not inconceivable, let's put it that way, that some indicators below the 50th percentile might actually be, driven higher beyond the 50th percentile. So I think that's a point that we need to give some further thought to, particularly for higher emitting or more impactful projects.
All right, next I have some questions on rural communities. Regarding the concern about capturing burdens in rural communities, did OEJE consider designating burdened areas based on either a consideration of burdens in a block group relative to the rest of the state or surrounding county, whichever is lower? This would mirror New Jersey's approach and could mitigate the risk of rural communities falling off the map.
That's a very good point that we can definitely take back. We right now, the way it is designed, it is a census block group is compared to census block groups across the whole state, not by county. So it's not something we have sort of played around with the map, but we can definitely it will be something that we'll take back to make sure that the folks that need to be sort of identified are identified in the map.
The next question, I believe, came in during the discussion of specific geographic areas overlap with burdened areas. The question is, and since there's no opportunity for overlap in large census block groups, no one will ever have to bother with this in rural spaces. How will you correct this automated injustice?
Sorry, Claire, could you read it again?
Yeah. And since there's no opportunity for overlap in large census block groups, no one will ever have to bother with this in the rural spaces. How will you correct this automated injustice? I think this is related to the comments from earlier regarding the census block groups being quite large in rural areas. And I think this came in during the discussion of SGA overlap with burdened areas to then conduct a CIA to provide some additional context, perhaps.
Sure. Well, again, one thing that I think is important to note is that the CIA tool is as it's designed and could, based on the good comments made here and elsewhere, be amended some. But again, the CIA tool is but one part of the overall environmental impact analysis, and place-based considerations and concerns, whether it be a big or a small census block, will be made. One thing that is, I think, really important about, for example, comparing different sites or routes is that it is not necessarily limited to any specific prescribed set of indicators, so that it's more of a free form of looking at what the overall impacts are and then judging between one route or site and another. So I just caution that it is important to understand that CIA is but one tool in a larger environmental impact assessment rubric.
One additional comment here is the size of a census block group, and I assume the references to the geographic, square miles, perhaps in the census block, is probably a reflection of sort of the rural versus urban character of that census block. The way the U.S. Census Bureau defines census blocks, it's actually a geographically contiguous area that has somewhere between roughly 600 and 3,000 people. They're supposed to be sort of similar population sizes in each census block. So just, the math alone tells you that in less densely populated areas, to capture the same number of people, you have a larger geographic area. So I think when we talk about size of census blocks and the question is about the larger census block group areas, that's really a proxy for a rural area. And I think we've explored that question a bit, that perhaps the measurements of burden in Mass EnviroScreen and in the proposed EFSB regulations tend to focus a little bit more on traditional pollutants and public health, which are probably more acute, threats and burdens in more populated areas. So we understand the sort of thrust of the question, and I think it does bring up again whether the tools are picking up on some of the burdens that are more particular for rural areas of the state, which is a very important issue.
The next question echoes some earlier comments regarding energy development in rural areas. How will the environmental impacts of CEIF installations, such as large-scale solar and storage facilities, be reflected on the Mass EnviroScreen? For example, will a new data layer reflecting all CEIF installations, or a layer for forest and farmland lost to CEIF, be added to the map and kept current as installations accelerate? If not, how will we track CEIF burden? Recently, at the in-person DOER info session here in Fitchburg, there was one town that reported as already having 20 large-scale solar installations. Those installations are likely dozens of acres each. That is certainly a new environmental burden.
Undersecretary Power or Sayana, would you like to address that question?
Certainly not. I mean, it's as you saw, not an indicator right now. We are definitely not. The list is not final of the list of indicators that we are considering for the Mass EnviroScreen. So it's definitely a good thing for us to consider in terms of how do we account for solar or renewable development in different parts of the state. So definitely, I guess I'm not really answering it, but we will take it back and try to see how we could overlay that.
Well, one thing that's true is with Mass GIS, which is what I think will become part of that. Mass GIS has a whole litany of, for example, sensitive populations and churches and hospitals and schools and things like that. It certainly is conceivable that there could be an additional data layer of CEIF and legacy power plant. In fact, I think legacy power plants are already there. So that could be something that could be another data layer for applicants and the board to review in relation to wherever the projects are located. I think that would be very helpful from a contextual perspective in evaluating a project.
A related question, Beckett currently has 4 proposed large solar and storage projects in its environmental justice community. Can this tool be used to mitigate these projects?
So the tool is definitely forward looking, but I'll pass it to Andy if you'd like to answer that, Andy.
Yeah, I think we have a theme running through a number of the questions that have been asked, which is when there's a concentration of project development, solar or other types of clean energy infrastructure, and I'm sure the concern extends to any legacy projects as well. Is that showing up somehow in the indicators, data, or expectations for the project developers' remedial actions? And I think that's an open question, to the extent that there have been multiple projects that have been developed and are operating in a single census block area or community. There may be some indications of that already in different kinds of data. To the extent that there's already been an environmental effect or perhaps anything affecting public health. Again, with clean energy projects, it's often less measurable, but not a non-issue. So I think, you know, we have some thinking to do to try and deal with the concern of the prevalence of projects and whether that in itself, regardless of whether it shows up in indicator data for health or environmental effects, is something that belongs in a cumulative impact analysis, in mass and virus screen, and you know the whole program that we're developing.
Thank you. And the next question, is there a definition for newly developed public right-of-ways? And I believe this is in relation to the applicability of CIA and site suitability.
That sounds like a legal question to me, so I'm looking to one of our attorneys to perhaps shed some light on that question. Daniel or Joan?
Well, I think Joan would be the person to answer that.
Thank you, Daniel. There is not a specific statutory definition of that term, but it has been the utility companies have provided some context for that term, but we have not defined that term in our regulations at this time.
Thanks, Joan. Next question, can you say more about how the applicant or board will decide when the project will materially exacerbate existing burdens and whether that standard changes depending on which indicator you're looking at?
Tim, would you like to address that?
Sure. So the question is, which does material exacerbation change across indicators? Is that the basic question?
It's a two-part question. So first, how would either the applicant or the board decide if a project does materially exacerbate an existing burden? And then if that standard changes depending on the indicator in question.
Okay. Well, again, the applicant makes the call as to if a project impacts a particular indicator, either a benefit, a negligible impact, no impact, or a material exacerbation of adverse impact. And the board then reviews and provides, supplementary data, in some cases qualitative, in some cases backed up by quantitative data. And the board evaluates that. So there's the actual definition of material exacerbation we discussed in the presentation, which is a perceptible change by the public or some measurable change, basically adverse change in the indicator itself. So it's sort of hard to say because there are so many different types of indicators, what that is for every single indicator. But again, the board will evaluate what the applicant provides in terms of those kinds of considerations for material exacerbation.
I would like to also note that the term materially exacerbate is not one that we've invented. It does come from the MEPA Environmental Justice Protocol, and that is the test and standard that MEPA has been using for a few years now to look similarly at effects of projects on environmental justice communities. So they took pains to try and define the term too, which is not.
Oh.
So it can be difficult, or at least it varies from impact to impact. And we, again, are using a similar concept in our approach.
Thank you. The next question, is the state aware that they could be using state data regarding income, environmental burden, and other socioeconomic or health indicators, DOR or mass health, for example?
Then, do you want to talk about the sources of the data?
Yes. Thank you for the question. We're still evaluating the indicator sources and whether there are more reliable data sources that we can extract some of the indicator data sets from. And so we will take that under consideration.
And some of our data sets are from the state, others from federal government, and others from other publicly available like consortiums of universities. So it is the sources vary depending on the data.
Thank you. And I believe we are at our final question submitted. How would a CIA address linear projects, especially long linear projects, that cross multiple burdened areas that have different elevated indicators in different geographies?
Tim, would you respond, please?
Sure. Our example project was a linear project that cut across over 20 census block groups, and we look at each we look at it's really no different. We look at the census block groups that the project and the corresponding SGA crosses. We look to see where there's overlap between the affected census block groups and burdened areas. And then we look at each and every one of those burdened areas in terms of what the indicators are, if there are any elevated indicators, i.e. over 50%, 50th percentile. And then we do our analysis of project impacts, determine whether there's a disproportionate adverse effect, as we discussed, and then come up with the appropriate remedial actions. So in sum, it's really quite the same as a project such as a solar farm that's in one place and one census block group. We just look at each and every one of those census block groups that overlap the SGA and determine if any of those are burdened census block groups.
One additional point I'd like to make is that the remedial actions that could be addressed for multiple burdened areas that are within the specific geographical area of a long linear project. Each one of those burdened areas could have its own menu of remedial actions. So you may have different indicators that are elevated and getting worse. In one burdened area, you might have a different set at 10 miles away in another community, and each of those burdened areas is treated individually so that the remedial measures are tailored to the conditions in that census block group and what the needs are in the community. We have another hand raised. I see Richard Kanoff.
Richard, I'm going to promote you to panelist.
Richard is still in the attendee group, Jonathan.
Yeah, I don't think he's accepted the promotion. It looks like you just unmuted. Richard, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. I know it's the end of the day. I'll be brief. One of the things I wanted to just comment on was this discussion about multiple projects in one community and how to get our arms around that as an approach. And it seems to me the site suitability assessment would be the tool that would work well to assess impacts in a community, particularly in the environmental sense, and particularly in a rural community in that circumstance. And that might be an opportunity to use both these tools in tandem. And I think that one of the takeaways, at least that I'm hearing, is they should be used in tandem. They focus on different concerns, one environmental, maybe more as built. I'm concerned just reading some of the proposed regulations that the site suitability part of it doesn't have the focus or the meat on the bones as the CIA part does, and that's unfortunate since they're both important. I also had, so that's one comment. The other thing I just wanted to explore as a hypothetical, on the hypothetical that was given on a T-line, what if you had a T-line that was like the hypothetical understreet on an undeveloped right-of-way that had a co-location opportunity, impacts on the understreet and co-location for environmental impacts were relatively low. The right-of-way development had higher environmental impacts. The community groups, and this is where I think it's important, given the EJ implications there, and the municipalities were in favor of understreet. It would seem that if you applied the site suitability assessment and the CIA, that would be the first step. You should apply them both. The site suitability assessment may work to focus more on environmental factors, and therefore understreet and co-location would be suggested using avoid and minimize. The CIA, it's hard to say whether there's any distinction in those routes with the CIA, and if it's not in a burden area, I question whether that would apply. And I raise that just to focus again on the two analyses. Approaches are different. They may have different outcomes, and I think it's important for the EFSB to be as specific as they can in whatever way they draft their regulations, to have a process that defines more specifically how the site suitability assessment will be applied. So that's kind of my bottom line. But I wanted to raise that other hypothetical because I think that as we go forward, in some fashion or another, the factors may be different, but we're going to have a balancing of environmental versus non-environmental and community inputs, and they're all going to be in this pot. And it's a hard job that you have to try to sort that all out. So I think one thing to concentrate on is more specificity, at least on the site suitability piece.
Thank you for your question, Mr. Canoff, and your sort of hypothetical on kind of alternative transmission line routes and in-street versus a new public right-of-way, or it sounds a little complicated. I'm not sure I understand all the dimensions of the hypothetical that you're talking about, but I do get your point about the sort of additional insights that you get from site suitability versus cumulative impact analysis. And you use the word built environment, which probably is a good word to describe the particular focus in the cumulative impact analysis versus maybe you could call it the natural environment, which site suitability definitely focuses more on in terms of forests, agricultural areas, and so forth. So, I think that this is a theme we're hearing, that people are seeing value in both systems and, are recommending that the board certainly give consideration to the place for both of them in its review. I'll just say that from my experience on the siting board, we are very inquisitive. We are always welcoming of additional information that comes into our records that may be relevant to the board's review of a proposal and its ultimate decision. And to the extent that there's value that really ought to be before the board for its decision making, that warrants very close consideration. And if any of my colleagues want to address any other aspects of the question, please do. And do we have any other questions, Claire, or any other hands raised?
No more written questions submitted.
I'm not seeing any new hands raised in the chat or in the participants.
Well, I think we're just about 5 minutes from wrapping up, and I think this may be the time to turn to Commissioner Rubin or Undersecretary Power for our
Yep.
sort of wrap up.
Thank you, Andy. Commissioner Rubin, you have the floor.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And hello again. So the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity, Siting Board members, and the Department of Public Utilities Siting Division, thank you so much for joining us today and for hanging with us for the past 3 hours. The questions and comments were incredibly thoughtful and constructive. The CIA team definitely has homework to do. I want to note that the siting division at the department is working very closely with EEA and the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity. Our next steps are to review the comments that you provided today and work on revisions to the OEJE guidance, Mass Enviro Screen, and the proposed cumulative impact analysis regulations. I encourage you to submit written comments by November 17th. Again, this is an informal public comment period. Written comments on Mass Enviro Screen and the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity guidance should be emailed to ej.inquiries@mass.gov. Written comments on the draft cumulative impact analysis regulations should be filed with sitingboard.filing@mass.gov. We ask that you include your comments as an email attachment. Please include the name of the person or the entity filing the comments. That's very helpful to us. The DPU will post comments regarding the regulations to our online file room. We will work to finalize the proposed cumulative impact analysis regulations for siting board review. If and when the siting board votes at an upcoming board meeting to approve the proposed CIA regulations, then we will begin the formal public comment process. That will include more opportunities for you to comment and influence our final regulations. We will announce a date and the details for the December siting board meeting, as well as public hearings, as soon as possible. We're going to post the recording of today's webinar and the slides in English and additional languages. That will be posted to the Energy Infrastructure Siting and Permitting Reforms website. I just want to note that integrating cumulative impact analysis into siting and permitting is critical, and we really appreciate your interest in this work. Thank you so much to the Office of Environmental Justice and Equity and the DPU teams. Undersecretary Power, Undersecretary Judge, Saina Mashmasarmi, Director Green, Tim Riley, Joan Foster Evans, Wayne Wong, Daniel Kelleher, Claire Lowe, Veena Dharmaraj, and Smitha Divakar. Thanks to Jonathan and Kessel and the rest of the ERG team. I also want to just thank our fabulous American Sign Language and 11 language interpreters. I also acknowledge we had other state agency staff who have collaborated with us and responded to our questions. There's also people here today who have advocated for cumulative impact analysis for many years. Thank you. And I'll just end by acknowledging the Clean Energy Infrastructure Siting and Permitting Commission for its work to help us get to this point. And with that, it's 4:59. I will close today's webinar. Be well and take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.